Imagine looking at the architectural blueprint for this massive, gleaming skyscraper.
Right, the initial drawings.
Yeah, exactly. And on paper, it's just perfectly drawn. The lines are clean, the load-bearing calculations are flawless, and the math just adds up beautifully.
But then you actually go visit the construction site a few years later,
Right.
and the finished building rarely matches that initial perfection.
Right.
You get there and realize, there's a whole extra wing nobody originally planned for.
Yo, yeah.
The foundation had to be completely altered to deal with unstable soil, and the plumbing is just this labyrinth of workarounds.
Because the elegant theory promises one thing, but the sheer physics of the real world demand another. And that brings us to today. Welcome to today's deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today we are looking at Reaganomics. And, because this is a topic that still reliably starts pretty heated arguments at Thanksgiving dinners, we are leaving our politics at the door. Our mission today, for you listening, is purely to analyze the data, the historical record, and the varied economic arguments from the source material. We aren't here to take a side or tell you who was right. We just want to impartially unpack the actual mechanics of an era that completely rewired American politics and culture.
Yeah, to set the stage here, we really need to define our terms first. So, Reaganomics is a portmanteau of Reagan and economics.
Right?
It's a term famously popularized by broadcaster Paul Harvey, and it refers to the sweeping neoliberal economic policies championed by U.S. President Ronald Reagan from 1981 to 1989.
And when we say neoliberal in this context,
We're talking about a shift away from heavy government intervention, moving toward market-oriented policies.
Yeah.
Think privatization, deregulation, and lower taxes.
which his supporters passionately defended as free market economics, while his opponents, and honestly even some of his fellow Republicans at the time, dismissed it as trickle-down or voodoo economics.
Yeah, voodoo economics was a popular critique. But at high level, the approach rested on four main pillars. First, significantly increasing defense spending. Second, slowing down the growth of domestic government spending.
Right.
Third, drastically reducing federal income and capital gains taxes. And fourth, tightening the money supply to combat inflation.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because before we can look at what Reagan actually did, we have to understand the crisis he inherited. I mean, you don't get a mandate to completely rewrite the American economic playbook unless the old playbook is visibly on fire.
And the late 1970s provided exactly that kind of fire. The U.S. economy was suffering from this grinding, really miserable condition called stagflation.
Stagflation.
Right, it was a toxic cocktail of high unemployment combined with persistently high inflation. Prices were soaring, but the economy wasn't growing.
Which completely broke every rule of standard economic theory at the time, right?
Oh, totally.
Because under the traditional Keynesian economic models, the ones that dominated since World War II, inflation and unemployment were supposed to operate on a seesaw. If the economy is booming, unemployment is low, but inflation might creep up because everyone has money to spend, and demand outpaces supply. But conversely, if the economy tanks, people lose jobs, but prices drop because nobody is buying anything.
But stagflation meant that seesaw essentially snapped in half.
Wow.
Both unemployment and inflation were punishingly high at the exact same time. The economic orthodoxy of the era was just baffled by it.
Yeah, you had those miles-long lines at the gas pumps, double-digit inflation eroding savings, and businesses just refusing to hire.
The public was desperate for a radical new approach, and enter supply-side economics.
And a massive part of the justification for this new approach was rooted in this concept called the Laffer curve.
Right, developed by Arthur Laffer.
Yeah, who actually served on Reagan's advisory board. And the fundamental theory here is that there's an optimal tax rate that maximizes government revenue. And if you tax people too heavily, you actually end up collecting less money.
A lot of people struggle with the mechanics of how that works, but it's fundamentally about human behavior. Like, if a government taxes earnings at 100%, nobody works, and the government collects $0. If they tax at 0%, everyone works, but the government still collects $0.
I always think about it like pricing tickets for a massive stadium concert.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, like if you charge just $1 a ticket, the stadium will completely sell out in 5 seconds, but you're going to make practically no money.
Right, exactly.
But on the flip side, if you charge $10,000 a ticket, the stadium will be completely empty, and you still make zero revenue.
You have to find that sweet spot.
Exactly. You find that exact spot where lowering the price actually increases your total revenue because so many more people show up to the concert and buy hot dogs and T-shirts.
And applied to the national economy, The supply-siders argued that the 1970s tax rates had become that $10,000 concert ticket.
Ah, I see.
They believed taxes were so punitive that they were actively discouraging people from working, investing, and innovating.
So it was stifling growth.
Right. Let's look at the mechanism. If a corporation faces a massive tax burden on its next dollar of profit, it won't build a new factory. It won't hire 100 new workers.
But if you lower that tax burden, they build the factory, they hire the workers, and then the government gets to tax the wages of those 100 new employees.
Yes. You expand the overall size of the economic pie so much that the government collects more total revenue, even though the slice they're taking is proportionately smaller.
It makes sense on paper.
But what's fascinating here is that Reagan didn't just rely on 1980s economists to sell this idea to the public. He actually drew inspiration from deep history. Specifically, a 14th century Arab scholar named Ibn Khaldun.
Wait, a 14th century philosopher being used to pitch a 20th century tax cut? That is an unbelievable bit of political framing.
It really is. Khaldun had observed the rise and fall of empires centuries ago. He noted that societies flourished when taxes were modest because citizens felt motivated to produce and, keep the fruits of their labor. But those same societies collapsed when taxes became burdensome to prop up bloated dynasties. Reagan actually paraphrased him in a 1981 press conference.
Really?
Yeah, he noted that at the beginning of a dynasty, great revenues are gained from small assessments, but at the end, small revenues are gained from large assessments.
I mean, that sounds incredible in a press conference. But grand, centuries-old philosophies tend to get pretty mangled when they make contact with the reality of Washington, D.C. politics. So how did this actually translate into policy?
The translation happened quickly and aggressively.
Hmm.
During his first year in office, Reagan signed the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981.
Okay.
This was a monumental piece of legislation. It slashed the top marginal tax bracket from 70% down to 50%.
Wow.
And eventually, through later legislation in 1986, that top rate dropped all the way to 28%.
Real quick, I want to clarify what a marginal tax bracket actually is for you listening, because it's a widely misunderstood concept.
It really is.
A 70% marginal rate didn't mean the government took 70% of everything a wealthy person earned. It meant that for every dollar they earned above a certain high threshold, they only got to keep 30 cents.
Exactly.
Dropping that to 50% and then 28% meant that suddenly high earners were keeping 72 cents of that last dollar instead of 30 cents. I mean, that is a staggering change to the incentive structure of the American economy in just a single decade.
It absolutely rewired corporate and individual incentives. But here is the plot twist in the historical record.
Okay, lay it on me.
Despite his enduring reputation as the ultimate champion of tax cuts, Reagan found himself facing exploding federal deficits shortly after that first bill passed.
Oh.
The economic boom just hadn't materialized fast enough to offset the lost revenue. So in 1982 and 1984, he signed bills that rolled back some of those initial cuts.
Wait.
In fact, tax historian Joseph Thorndike actually characterized the 1982 legislation as the biggest tax increase ever enacted during peacetime.
Wait a minute, stop right there. Reagan is the absolute poster child for cutting taxes. How could he possibly authorize the biggest peacetime tax hike in American history? That breaks the entire narrative.
It comes down to the difference between the headline tax rate and the effective tax base.
Okay.
The top marginal rates, the headline numbers everyone sees, stayed much lower than they were in the 1970s. But Reagan's later bills aggressively closed loopholes and removed deductions.
Ah, I see.
They changed corporate depreciation rules and tightened tax compliance. By forcing people and corporations to pay taxes on money that was previously shielded by accounting tricks, the government drastically increased its revenue collection compared to the 1981 baseline.
Because they desperately needed the cash.
Exactly.
Because they were bleeding revenue from the rate cuts, but simultaneously pouring money into the first pillar you mentioned earlier, which was defense spending.
Defense spending skyrocketed during this era. It rose to roughly 6% of the total gross domestic product.
That's a math.
It was a level of military expenditure unseen since the height of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. They were funding new weapon systems, expanding the Navy, and investing heavily in the Cold War arms race.
So the math becomes incredibly precarious here. You're drastically lowering the main income tax rates, hoping growth eventually pays for it. But you are buying billions of dollars worth of military equipment right now. That requires massive borrowing.
And borrow they did. The United States took on heavy debt, both domestically and abroad, to cover those yawning budget deficits. During Reagan's presidency, the national debt nearly tripled. It went from $997 billion to $2.85 trillion.
Tripled. Wow.
Yeah, and as a direct result, the U.S. transitioned from being the world's largest international creditor to the world's largest debtor nation. Reagan himself was acutely aware of this. He famously described the exploding debt as the greatest disappointment of his presidency.
Okay, so we have sweeping theories, we have massive tax legislation, and we have a tripling of the national debt. Let's look at the actual outcomes. So what does this all mean? How did this impact everyday Americans living through the 1980s?
The historical data presents a deeply polarized picture.
Okay.
If you view the economy from 30,000 feet like, the macroeconomic level, there were undeniable historic victories. Real GDP, which is the total output of the goods and services in the economy, grew by over a third during his presidency.
That's huge.
That's an average annual growth rate of 3.5%.
That kind of sustained growth is just massive.
It is an incredible run of expansion. And the misery index we discussed earlier, that brutal combination of inflation and unemployment, shrank drastically.
Right.
Inflation plummeted from a terrifying 13.5% in 1980 down to just 4.1% by 1988. Unemployment fell from 7.2% to 5.5%. Millions of non-farm jobs were created. By those traditional metrics, the American economy came roaring back to life.
But when you look at the ground level, the data tells a much more fractured story.
It does.
The overall economic pie got larger, but the slices were distributed very differently than in previous decades. Real wages for working-class Americans actually continued to decline, which was a trend that had begun in the 1970s. Meanwhile, the top 1% of income earners saw their share of the national income skyrocket.
The income gap widened significantly, and there were visible, visceral consequences in American cities.
Yeah.
During Reagan's first term, critics highlighted a severe surge in urban homelessness. Researchers noted the homeless population nearly doubled in just 3 years, from 1984 to 1987. They often point to aggressive cuts in federal housing assistance and social services as a primary driver.
And when confronted with this crisis, Reagan's response was highly controversial.
Yeah, in a late presidency interview with David Brinkley, Reagan stated his belief that the homeless made it their own choice for staying out there. He argued that there were shelters available that people simply chose not to use. He also asserted that a large proportion of the homeless population were mentally impaired, a situation he attributed to lawsuits by organizations like the ACLU that made it harder to institutionalize people against their will.
So we are left with this wildly conflicting picture. The inflation monster is slain and the overall GDP is booming, but working-class wages are stagnating and homelessness is spiking.
Exactly.
It's almost like installing a massive jet engine on a train to shatter speed records, but quietly uncoupling half the passenger cars at the station. The locomotive is performing better than ever, but a lot of people got left behind on the platform.
That's a great analogy. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this precise divergence is why brilliant economists can look at the exact same data from the 1980s and draw entirely different conclusions about whether Reaganomics was actually a success.
Let's look at how the different camps interpret that data. On the right, supporters like the Cato Institute, economist Stephen Moore, and the legendary Milton Friedman view this era as just an unmitigated triumph.
Yes, they do.
Their perspective is that the combination of tax cuts, deregulation, and free trade unleashed the greatest sustained wave of prosperity the country had ever seen.
Moore argues that these policies produced a $15 trillion increase in American wealth.
Unbelievable.
From this viewpoint, the 1981 tax cut was the profound engine of that growth. By letting people keep more of their money, it restored consumer and investor confidence, incentivizing this massive entrepreneurial revolution that essentially modernized the American economy.
But then you have the left-wing perspective championed by economists like Paul Krugman, who argues that this massive expansion wasn't magic, and it certainly wasn't the tax cuts.
Right.
Krugman argues it was just the natural business cycle playing out.
The argument here is essentially the concept of pent-up demand. The economy was bouncing back from a very deep, painful recession in 1981 and 1982. When an economy contracts that severely, people delay buying houses, cars, appliances.
Yeah, you just hold on to your cash.
Exactly. When things finally stabilize, all that delayed spending floods the market at once. Krugman's view is that when you hit the absolute bottom, the only way to go is up, and there's plenty of room to grow rapidly, regardless of what the tax rate is.
Critics also point out that the dramatic drop in inflation, which honestly was arguably the real miracle of the 1980s, was actually the work of the Federal Reserve Chair, Paul Volcker.
Right, who was appointed by Jimmy Carter, Reagan's predecessor.
Exactly.
Volcker used incredibly strict monetary policy to crush inflation. Specifically, he drastically raised interest rates. The prime rate peaked at over 20%.
20%? That is wild.
Think about the mechanics of that. With interest rates that high, nobody takes out a mortgage to buy a house, and businesses just can't afford loans to expand. It deliberately chokes off borrowing and slows the economy to a crawl. It was a brutal, painful process that intentionally caused a recession to squeeze inflation out of the system. Critics argue Volcker's willingness to inflict that pain, not Reagan's tax cuts, is the true hero of the inflation story.
And what I find so fascinating here is that the debate wasn't just left versus right. There was an intense internal feud among conservatives as well.
Oh, absolutely.
Like Greg Mankiw, right? He's a conservative Republican economist who later served under George W. Bush. He referred to the extreme supply-siders, the ones who claimed that tax cuts would 100% pay for themselves without any spending cuts. He literally called them charlatans and cranks.
Charlatans and cranks. Even traditional mainstream supply-siders sounded the alarm. Martin Feldstein, who served as Reagan's own chairman of the Council of Economic Advisers, felt the new extremists in his own party were making these wild, hyperbolic claims.
Right.
Feldstein argued this loose talk gave fundamentally sound economic policies a bad name and provided political cover for the massive budget deficits we discussed earlier.
The contradictions are just everywhere, especially when you look at deregulation. Deregulation was supposedly a core pillar of the Reagan Revolution. Get the government off the backs of businesses. But the historical record on whether he actually deregulated the economy is shockingly mixed.
This is one of the great paradoxes of his presidency. On one hand, William Niskanen, an architect of Reaganomics, pointed out that Reagan actually added more trade barriers than any administration since Herbert Hoover in the 1930s.
Wow.
He restricted imports significantly to protect domestic industries like automobiles and steel.
But then you have Milton Friedman arguing the exact opposite. He pointed out that the number of pages added to the Federal Register, which is that massive daily journal where all new government rules and regulations are published, that declined sharply under Reagan.
And they are both technically correct. It comes down to the mechanics of how the government operates. You have to understand the difference between statutory deregulation and administrative deregulation.
Okay, break that distinction down for us.
So, statutory deregulation involves Congress actually passing new laws to remove regulations from the books. That process was fairly slow under Reagan. In fact, a lot of major industry deregulation, like the airlines and the trucking industry, had already been initiated under Jimmy Carter.
Interesting.
Administrative deregulation, however, is about how federal agencies actually enforce the rules that already exist.
Oh, I see. So it's not about changing the speed limit. It's about telling the highway patrol to stop pulling people over.
That is a perfect way to conceptualize it.
Yeah.
By cutting the budgets of regulatory agencies, appointing agency heads who favored a lighter touch, and intentionally slowing down the drafting of new rules, Reagan dramatically changed the regulatory environment administratively.
Right.
He didn't need Congress to repeal laws left and right to make businesses feel less scrutinized.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. If the results are this mixed-like, if the national debt nearly tripled, if working-class wages stagnated while inequality rose, if even his own conservative economic advisors were calling some of the math crank science, and the deregulation record is full of asterisks, why does Reaganomics remain such a powerful, enduring blueprint today? Why is it still the baseline for so much political rhetoric 40 years later?
Because, regardless of the granular data or the internal contradictions, Reaganomics successfully shifted the entire baseline of American economic confidence.
Okay.
After the misery, the gas lines, and the malaise of the 1970s, Reagan offered a highly effective narrative of optimism. He fundamentally changed the conversation from, what can the government do to fix this, to how can we get the government out of your way so you can fix it.
Right.
Even if the reality involved massive tax hikes in '82 and exploding federal deficits, the ideology of low taxes and free markets became deeply embedded in the American psyche. It set the absolute terms of economic debate for the next 4 decades.
The narrative and the emotional shift were ultimately stronger than the math.
Often, in the history of American politics, they are. Which brings us to one final lingering irony from the historical record that perfectly encapsulates the gap between the blueprint and the building.
Laid it on me.
When Ronald Reagan was campaigning, Part of his incredibly effective branding was a promise to drastically shrink the size of the federal government. He specifically vowed to completely abolish two massive cabinet-level agencies, the Department of Energy and the Department of Education.
Okay.
And yet, the record shows he failed to abolish either of them. Far from shrinking the president's cabinet, he actually expanded it by elevating Veterans Affairs to full cabinet-level department status.
Oh, wow.
And overall, the number of federal civilian employees actually increased by 4.2% under his watch.
That is wild.
It leaves you wondering, is it actually possible for any modern president to shrink the federal government, or does the machinery of a superpower simply demand constant expansion, regardless of who sits in the Oval Office?
Keep that gap between political branding and bureaucratic reality in mind the next time you hear a politician make massive economic promises. It is never as simple as the theory suggests. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the numbers, the narratives, and the messy reality of Reaganomics. We'll catch you next time.